I'm going to show you a very important game played at the World Blitz Championships. Magnus Carlsen playing with the white pieces against Yu Yangyi from China is a true Blitz specialist. But Magnus is the current title holder. He managed to win the event last year, and actually in the last couple of 6-7 years I think he managed to win all of them except one edition in 2021. MVL, Maxime Vaugel managed to win that event, but Magnus, of course, is the big favorite to win this event. But let's see how it's going in this game. Magnus, playing with white, goes for 1 e4, and Yu Yangyi, as I said, he's a Blitz specialist. He played Magnus Carlsen many times in Blitz, even managed to win a couple of times against him. He usually goes for the Petrov defense, so no surprise here. White captures on e5, and after d6, knight f3 back, knight takes e4. Now, majority of the games features here the move d4. It's by far the main continuation, but Magnus drops a first surprise. He doesn't want to get a theoretical battle, he just wants to get a game. So he deviates from the main lines here with just a random move. He played the move h3. And of course, it's not really a bad move. The question is if it's really important here to cover the g4 square. Should white be worried about the bishop coming out to g4? But I think Magnus says, okay, we just get a game. You have to think here on your own. Maybe he just tries to win a bit of time. Anyway, black goes for the move d5 and Magnus goes for the move d3. Attacking the knight. And where's the knight going? Well, frankly speaking, I was a bit surprised to see Yu Yangyi's choice here of dropping back to d6. I know there are a lot of lines in the Petrov where the knight actually goes back to this square, but why not just to go back to f6? I don't think there's anything wrong with that move either, because on d6 you're kind of restricting the development of your dark squared bishop. And now Magnus played interesting move, which leads to a position we have never seen before in the Petrov opening. Magnus played the move c4. Interesting idea, attacking the pawn. And here also, I think Yu Yangyi played a little bit strange move. He says that, okay, I'm not afraid of white capturing that pawn. He just ignores it by playing the move bishop e7. Why not just take the pawn on c4? If you do take, you get a symmetrical position in which both sides have the possibility to develop their remaining minor pieces pretty fast. It's a game, unusual position at move 8 already. I think Magnus is happy with this position, although objectively there's nothing wrong with black's position either. Anyway, bishop e7 on the board, and white just captures the pawn on d5. And it will not be easy for black regaining that pawn, because that knight on d6 is obstructing also the queen, covering the d5 square. So now just a couple of developing moves. Castling kingside, knight c3, and look at this. Black plays here the move b5. Very interesting idea. The knight protects the pawn, and black is ready to play b4 at some point to chase the knight away from its defensive task, protecting the pawn on d5. Therefore, white plays the move a3, securing the knight on c3, covering the b4 square. Bishop b7. So now here we see black's plan being revealed. Bishop hits the pawn, although it's still protected. But imagine just in a few moves a knight can come to attack that pawn. That will be big news for black. But first, white goes for the move d4, opening up the diagonal for the bishop. So white is attacking the pawn on b5 twice. Therefore, black plays the move a6. And here, Magnus goes for the very modest move bishop e2. Why not just developing the bishop to a more active square? I think the bishop is much nicer placed here, but Magnus has a very concrete idea in mind. He goes for bishop e2, and after knight e7, he goes for this move, knight e5. That's an interesting move, because black is definitely not going to take on e5, then white's pawn structure will be improved again. But the main point is that now very soon this bishop can come to f3 to protect the pawn on d5 one more time. So for instance, knight b6, with the idea to hit the pawn on d5, runs into bishop f3, and white is having a very nice position here. It will be difficult for black regaining the pawn. Therefore, knight b6 not played, bishop f6 on the board. So black is questioning this knight on e5, and you can see the bishop coming out to f4 with tempo, in the sense that you're developing a piece and protecting the knight at the same time. But Magnus had a different idea in mind. He goes for knight c6. So he's attacking the queen. Black takes the knight. White recaptures with a pawn, attacking the knight. The knight goes to b6 and white castles here. Everything going according to plan, but black is playing here the move knight f5. And the knight, together with the bishop and the queen, is tending to take the pawn on d4. So white advances the pawn to d5. It's protected by the queen and the knight, but it does allow black to eliminate that defender on c3 with bishop takes c3, pawn takes c3. Now black is able to take on d5 and regain the pawn. But the question is how to take on d5. I mean, you would expect here a move like queen takes d5, honestly, because now after the queens are coming off the board, okay, it's a complicated position. White has the bishop pair, but the knights, they look pretty active as well. I think white is a bit better, but black is active, and that kind of keeps the position in balance. But knight takes d5 was played, but I think this is not such a great move, because now white has this possibility to play here the move bishop to f3, and that's very good move because you're attacking the knight on d5. And it could be this move was overlooked by Yu Yangyi, because now after taking the pawn on c3, there is this move queen to c2, and both knights, they're under an attack and you cannot really defend against it. I mean, if you play here the move queen f6, there will follow bishop b2, and the knight on c3 is pinned. So therefore, black has a problem. He cannot take the pawn on c3. The knight went back to b6, but now the bishop comes out to f4. And you see that white's pieces are being activated now. And even though the queens can be exchanged here, it's something black doesn't really want to do. If you do go for this exchange, then the pawn on c7 proves to be a huge weakness. It's now under attack by the bishop, and well, white is just going to press in this endgame with a nice pawn on c6. Black is in trouble. So no exchange of queens. Knight d6 was played here, and you see that black is trying to hold the position together. White can dictate the course of the game. There are various ways of improving the position. Of course, placing a rook on the open file strongly comes into consideration, but Magnus goes for simplifications. He trades off this good bishop for this knight, and it's very understandable because after exchanging queens and black does recapture, you do have a passed pawn. And the question is, of course, whether this is a weakness or an asset. Well, first, white brings the rook to the d file, hitting the pawn on d6. Black goes with the rook from a8 to d8. It's very important to take that rook, because if you play the other rook to d8, there is the move c7, attacking the rook on d8, and the bishop hits the rook on a8. So therefore, rook a8, white brings the rook to d4, intending to double on the d file to hit the pawn on d6. And here we get very important moment, because Yu Yangyi played here the move d5. It's a blitz game. Both sides did make some couple of inaccurate moves in this game, but this is a very logical move. And looking at the position, I'm thinking that black is doing pretty okay here. He's about to go rook d6, and thanks to this move d5, you have closed the diagonal for the bishop to support that passed pawn. If black has time here to go rook d6 and take that pawn, he's in good shape, right? So what is Magnus really planning to do here? Well, now we see the critical moment of the game, and Magnus had very well evaluated the consequences of this exact position, because look at what he does now. This is absolutely brilliant. He played here the move a4, and I think this was definitely underestimated or even overlooked by Yu Yangyi. But because what white is planning to do here is to remove these pawns from b5, maybe even later the pawn on d5, to improve the strength of this pawn on c6, so that the rooks and the bishop, they can further support the advance of that passed pawn. Now the big question, how is this gonna work out? Because this pawn on a4 can be taken in two different ways. Well, if you do take with the pawn, then the rook will come to the b file to hit the knight, and here we see black is unable to main that sort of blockade. The knight is in big trouble. If you move it away to c4, then the pawn on d5 is hanging. There's bishop takes d5, you're attacking the knight on c4, the pawn becomes really strong, white is just much better. Instead, if you decide here to protect that knight on b6 with the move rook b8. There is rook db4 and the knight is now standing in the pin. So you got to give up your knight on b6. So taking with the pawn on a4 is not possible. By the way, one of the main ideas of this move a4 is that if you ignore white's plan, you play the move rook d6, continuing with this plan black intended to go for anyway, rook d6. Now this pawn goes to a5. And here you are attacking the knight. And if knight goes away, then again, you can take with the bishop on d5. Not only winning a very important pawn, but saving your pawn on c6. Not giving black the chance to win that pawn back. So let's see. In the game, there follow the move knight takes a4. Still, everything seems to be under control. Pawn on d5 can be taken. But then there's maybe knight takes c3. But look now. Another huge pawn sacrifice. The pawn comes to c4. Absolutely brilliant. The idea is that the b pawn cannot take on c4 because then the knight on a4 will just be taken. So you got to make another move here. You can take with the d pawn, which was played in the game, but there are other options as well. One move I want to point out and show to you here is the move knight c5, moving the knight away. And if you take with a pawn on d5, black can even go for the move knight b3. Now I think this was considered by both players, but here white can just continue by going back with the rook to d1. Black is going to take, rook takes a1 in this position. How to evaluate? You're an exchange down as white, but these pawns are really strong, and I don't think this bishop on f3 is any worse than the rook on f8. In fact, white is winning here as the pawns are very nicely supported by each other, but also by the bishop and the rook. Back to the game. Yu Yangyi decided here to take the pawn on c4. So the position gets open now. Rooks are being exchanged here. And now the pawn goes to c7, attacking the rook on d8. And this is fantastic because the pawn cannot be stopped. If you do play here this move, rook c8, there is rook to d1. And nothing can be done against rook d8 with check. It's a back rank mate. And otherwise, if you do something about it, the c-pawn will be promoted. It will become a queen on the d8 square. So this is just winning for white. The rook cannot come to c8. Therefore, the rook went to f8. But now the bishop can just come to b7. That's very nice because you are planning to promote this pawn and you cannot really stop it. I mean, if you play here something like knight b6, then it's rook takes a6, for instance, when you are attacking the knight and black is unable to maintain a blockade. If you do put the knight on c8, the rook will come to a8 and white has more control over the promotion square than black. So therefore, Yu Yangyi desperately tried to generate counterplay with its pawn. Push the pawn to c3. Now it's time to get a new queen. Black has to give up the rook. Bishop takes c8, but the pawns are not dangerous. If you try to run, it's just rook c1 and the pawn will be taken next. So the pawns got to run together with the move b4. So pawns are supporting each other. Don't take the knight on a4 because it allows the move c2. Black is one move away from getting a new queen. If you go back, there's the move b3. Next move, the pawn will come to b2 and one of these pawns will become a queen. So therefore, don't be too greedy. You don't have to win more material. You are already a rook up. Just neutralize the danger with the move bishop f5. That's a good move. Knight goes to c5 because with the bishop covering that square, white was just about to take that knight on that square. Rook a5, the rook can just become active, hits the knight on c5. If the knight goes away, you can just take on a6. One pawn has been eliminated. You're about to give a check and, well, it's just winning. So black played here the move g6, attacking the bishop, but now rook takes c5, g takes f5. Are these pawns any dangerous here? Well, if you do take the pawn on f5, then you have a big problem because the pawns are unstoppable. If the rook comes back, he can only stop one pawn at a time. The other pawn will come to b2 and then to b1. So rather than taking that useless pawn on f5, it's time to bring another piece into defense. Here it's the move king f1. The king got to come over to stop these pawns. Now, black tried to bring up the other pawn. Well, if you do take on a5, that's a bad move. Once again, the rook got to stay behind this passed pawn, so better just bring the king. Black continues with the move a4, but after king d3, the king is just close enough, and after b3, you can just take with the king. And here Yu Yangyi resigned. A very important and impressive win by the reigning champion. And with his victory, he managed to come back to the top of the field, and eventually he managed to score 16 points out of 21 games, winning the event alone. And who was his nearest rival? Well, Daniil Dubov. Remember that guy from the previous video who just prearranged a draw with his compatriot Jan Nepomniachtchi. Dubov ended half a point behind Magnus Carlsen, and that was a very costly half a point. If he would have just played a normal draw with Nepo, then it would have been a tiebreak if everything would have going accordingly. But it didn't happen. First place, Magnus Carlsen. Second place, Daniil Dubov. And in third place, I think it was Artemiev. So very nice performance by Magnus Carlsen, winning for the 7th time in his career the World Blitz Championships. And I think scoring the double, winning the Rapid, and then the World Blitz Championships in these 5 days, that's not a bad way of finishing the year 2023. Hope you enjoyed this video. Subscribe to the channel, and soon much more exciting games covered on this channel.